Greetings, everyone, and thank you for attending our webcast today. My name is Leif Lowe, and I'll be your moderator. I'd like to welcome you to today's webcast entitled Protecting the Enterprise, Smart Strategies for Identity and Access Management. This event is brought to you today by FCW and sponsored by Okta. Well, as government agencies continue in their efforts to modernize their IT infrastructure, their ability to successfully manage the identities of both internal and external users, whether those are employees, constituents, contractors, partners, suppliers, whomever, becomes more critical than ever before. Many of the advanced technologies that can improve government agencies' efficiency and effectiveness can also alter the security landscape. Things like using cloud computing platforms, the Internet of Things, mobile devices and solutions, and other technologies are tremendous tools to help improve the productivity and capability of government agencies, but they can also increase the potential attack surface. As traditional perimeter security becomes a less viable means of protecting government systems and networks, authenticating identity and authorizing access is emerging as a new front in this escalating war against cyber attackers. During today's webcast, you'll learn how to assess the merits of a cloud-based identity management system, how federal agencies are bolstering their identity access management efforts, why user access controls have to be user-friendly, how to apply lessons learned from the field, and how to prioritize best practices of an effective access management program. Our featured speakers today are Karen Reggie and Ted Gerard. Karen is the Chief Information Officer for the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls at the Department of State, and Ted Gerard is the Vice President of Public Sector at Okta. Well, thank you all again for joining us today. Before we get rolling, I just have a few housekeeping items to cover. First of all, during the presentation today, if you'd like to enlarge the slides, just look for the square icon in the top right corner of the slide window. You can also view the presentation in full screen mode by clicking on the squared arrows icon. If you would like to submit a question at any time, which we strongly encourage you to do, just look for the question field below to the left of the slide window. Type your question in there and hit submit, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. Should you have any technical difficulties during the session, just look for the yellow question mark icon below the slide window. Click there and someone will be able to help you out. If you'd like to download a copy of the presentations you're about to see, just look for the Resource Center below the question field. And then finally, within the next day or two, we'll email you a link to an archived version of this session so you can review it again or pass it along and share with a colleague. The on-demand version will be available for 90 days after today. And now, without further ado, I'd like to hand things over to Karen.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be here. I'm going to start out by running through a little bit of the agenda for the presentation part of this webinar. I'm going to do a little overview about the DDTC IT modernization and our objectives for identity and access management. We'll turn it over to Ted, who's going to talk a little bit about Okta, and then we'll have a roundtable discussion and a Q&A. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about what the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls is. We're part of the Department of State, and we're a regulatory agency. And what we do is we ensure that commercial exports of defense articles and defense services are consistent with U.S. national security and foreign policy objectives. So what we're doing is we are basically adjudicating licenses for any entity in the defense community that wants or needs to export those goods and services overseas. So we establish and maintain the regulations, which is referred to as the ITAR. We register entities and individuals, and everyone that does business with the Department of State Directorate of Defense Trade Controls must be registered. We adjudicate export licenses. We respond to any inquiries about the process or any questions that people have about whether or not we have jurisdiction over their commodity or the service. And then we promote and enforce compliance of our rules. So on the right-hand side here is just a little bit about myself that you can read at some point. And we'll sort of move on. All right, so I love this slide. I'm not exactly sure, on the left-hand side, what we're doing here, but I think the cluttered desk is sort of a great metaphor for our legacy systems. We have a lot of data. It's in a lot of different places. It's duplicated. It's not easy to access. We're not as transparent as we might like to be, both to our regulatees, but also even within the directorate. And so when I came on board, I was tasked with modernizing DDTC's IT platforms. We have a series of legacy systems that have come online over the last 2 decades. And I had some experience with doing, cloud-based technologies. And the new platform that we are in the process of deploying is called the Defense Export Control and Compliance System. And, of course, we have an acronym. It's DEX. And what it's going to do is, we've already launched pieces of it, but by the end of the year, we'll have launched the entire application suite, and it basically will transform all these disparate systems into a single system, a single online access point for industry, and a single set of tools for our internal users to be able to more quickly and more efficiently process registration applications, licenses, questions, retransfer requests, and all the other different types of things that we need to look at. So this is really a case management application. So that our major use case is case management, and it's common in all of government to have case management dealing with an industry or citizen-facing. And so it has its own unique challenges as a primary use case for identity management. So regarding the topic of identity management, I've been in the software, I've done a lot of software development for government and non-government. And back in, I'm probably dating myself a bit, but we always did all of this using whatever we were using, we would always build it ourselves, right? And so coming into this role, I was unaware of what was available in the marketplace and assumed that we would be building identity management and access control in our application. And so I was really fortunate relatively early on, that I learned about, I was at a ServiceNow conference, and I learned about the FCC's use of ServiceNow and the various tools associated with that. And FCC their plan was to use platform as a service for everything. And this is a regulatory agency, and the good news there was that I really understood the use cases because I had spent 10 years at the FCC. And so it was very interesting to see those presentations and notice that they were using ServiceNow, Okta, and Box. And, frankly, after that presentation, I said to myself, I think I'm done, because if it works for the FCC, it's going to work for the State Department, because the FCC licensing process is extremely complicated, and not to say that the Department of State's process is uncomplicated. It's complicated in different ways, not from an IT platform perspective, but more from making sure, the stakes are really high with exports, and making sure that you don't allow an export through a bad guy or to the wrong countries. So in looking at access management and recognizing at that point that there was an off-the-shelf product, which because I've been so involved in software, both in my government career and also when I was in the private sector, I did what lots of government people do, which is, okay, what is going to be the easiest for me and my team? And how can I get out of this business and go back to what we do as a mission? So I wanted ease of procurement. I wanted to make sure that it was FISMA, that it was FedRAMP approved. I wanted to make sure that there was simplicity in configuring and implementing it, both with custom applications and with software as a service or platforms as a service. And so those were sort of my criteria for an access management system. And, based on these objectives and the requirements and the fact that there was a proven case that was so similar to ours at the FCC, we chose Okta as our IAM solution, with the main focus of our use case being the external users, which we have thousands of external regulatees that come into the system every day to request adjudication of licenses. So, and then somewhere along the line, it was after I had made the decision and I had worked with the Maine Department of State to keep them in the loop in terms of what I was doing for my use case. I was invited to be part of a Tiger team to sort of look at this issue more broadly across the Department of State. And that was, the use cases are more complicated in that there's lots of internal users of all different types, both in country and out of country. There's contractor personnel, there's local personnel at the posts, there's external users, needing visas and passports and all of those things that our consular affairs colleagues do. And what we ended up doing was, coming up with a set of criteria in that case as well, and kind of selecting a best-of-breed approach with Radiant Logic, SailPoint, CyberArk, and Okta. So we have all four of those tools that will be used, and we're sort of right at the beginning of deploying those things for sort of the larger Department of State for all the users, internal and external. So this slide basically just covers how to get in touch with us, with my IT modernization team, and general inquiries about what we do, and then technical assistance for what we do. Those are the contact information. So I'm going to turn it back over to Leif, who's going to introduce Ted.
All right. Thank you very much, Karen. Sounds like you've got some great modernization efforts there underway at your department. All right. And as Karen said, now I would like to introduce Ted Gerard with Okta. Take it away, Ted.
Yeah, thanks, Leif. I appreciate it. Karen, awesome. So first off, I'm Ted Gerard. I'm the VP of Public Sector at Okta. And what I'd like to do is take maybe the next 5 minutes and tell you who Okta is. I'm assuming some people on the WebEx know who we are. Probably a bunch of you have never heard of us before. So Okta was founded in 2009, and we launched what was called the Okta Identity Cloud. And we pioneered a concept called, in a new market called Identity as a Service. And our founders realized really early on that the world was changing, that mobile, cloud, SaaS was going to transform the way that IT services were consumed and delivered. And they also recognized that the current slew of identity management systems were ill-suited to meet that transformation. So what they thought was needed was a modern cloud platform for identity that would reduce complexity, would increase uptime and security, would remove end-user friction, and can be deployed in record time and cloud speed type time. And so that's what they set out to build, and they launched the Okta Identity Cloud. The Okta Identity Cloud, I'm going to scroll to the next slide here, is a platform service built up of independent identity services. At the base of our service is something that we call Universal Directory, and that's what allows us to connect to all the disparate identity stores throughout your enterprise, delivering a 360-degree view of who's who within the enterprise, both internal and external. And then we have a series of services like single sign-on. Once we get past that, we can step up authentication and multi-factor authentication. We can automate the provisioning and deprovisioning of users with our lifecycle management capability. We can secure identities across APIs with our API access management capability. And then we can have software development kits where you can embed Okta into your custom application. So if you've ever logged into Experian to check out if your name's on the dark web, it looks like you're logging into Experian, but you've actually just logged into Okta. If you log into JetBlue to check on your frequent flyer miles, you've actually logged into Okta. If you use Adobe's Creative Cloud or Marketing Cloud, you're actually using Okta, and that's That's our external-facing piece. So at Okta, and Karen really just did a good job of describing this next slide for us at the State Department. At Okta, we view the world in two different lenses. One is we've got a series of products. Although we have a single platform, we've got use cases for what we call workforce identity, and those are to support employees and contractors that show up to work every day to do their most significant work for the agency mission that they serve. But then there's also a set of solutions from Okta that supports our customer's customer. And in Karen's case, that's where she fell. When we first met with her, she was trying to solve the problem of, hey, I've got to modernize my system that interfaces with aerospace and defense contractors in this new case management system we've built. That's a very strong play from Okta. So what we're able to do at State Department is solve Karen's problem, but then have a bigger discussion with all of state and say, hey, we can also solve the workforce identity problem as well. So we see a joint use case solution on a single platform from Okta. Kind of our founders' view of the history and future of identity looks something like this. So yesterday, the network was the perimeter, and we put everything we had in our data centers, protected the perimeter with firewalls and VPNs, and we got our identity as part of the application stack. And we were, organizations were either an Oracle shop or a Microsoft shop or a CA shop, and your identity was part of that stack, and you bought all the corresponding infrastructure and got the people, and you built it yourself. And Karen kind of alluded to that. She started off thinking, I'm going to build it myself. And typically when you build it yourself, you customize the daylights out of it to make it your own. What we see today is that no longer works. Trying to extend that infrastructure into a mobile cloud SaaS type environment is really complex. It's very costly. It's time consuming, and quite frankly, doesn't work as elegantly as systems that were purpose built for this modern compute era. So at Okta, the thought is identity needs to be its own independent and neutral platform. You need to connect to everything. You need to connect to cloud. You need to connect to on-premise. Anywhere the data seems to be, you need to be able to connect there quickly and securely. And in order to do that, you have to be an independent and neutral platform to do it. You've also got to be able to deliver identity as a microservice for organizations that are building their own apps and embedding identity in that app in a clean, simple, seamless fashion that looks like the application. You get your developers to build the best experience of the application they're building and not have to worry about the security because you can outsource that. Like I said, companies like Experian and Adobe have done that. Looking forward, we've got a pretty bold vision. We think that identity needs to be a universal platform that connects everyone to everything, and it's our goal to become the identity standard. So in the beginning, I said, Okta's 6,000 customers globally, global brands around the world, every single vertical. I run public sector and federal in specific, and we've seen a really rapid adoption. So today is a pretty auspicious day. We started the Okta public sector vertical on February 12th, 2016. So today's our 3-year anniversary doing business in the public sector space. And the beginning was a little difficult in that, we were a commercial cloud service. We didn't speak federal government language, and there were certain things we needed to do in order to be consumable by the federal government. Karen alluded to that. She said, I needed someone that was FedRAMP authorized. The very first thing we did was enter the FedRAMP process, and that took us from February of 16 to April 2017 with our sponsor, Department of Justice. Karen was one of the early adopters after that. Once we had it, she's like, let me see it. And since then, we've seen a really rapid adoption of Okta in the federal market space. One thing that's in common across all these logos, and these aren't obviously all of our customers in the Fed space, but one thing that's common, or actually there are two things in common. One was every one of these customers was doing some fairly major modernization initiative. With Karen, it was modernizing DEX. With others, Navy was My Navy Portal, but there's got to be some modernization initiative. And the second thing that's common amongst all of them is they realized
That's an impressive list of agencies that you're working with there, Ted.
Thank you.
For sure. Absolutely. And I've certainly used Okta then, logging into JetBlue. I'm a liar there. All right, now let's dive in a little bit deeper and hear some more about what you've experienced and what you're doing there at the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, Karen, before we get into the audience Q&A portion. Now, Ted mentioned that you were certainly an early adopter. Now, Karen, when did your agency realize you had an identity management issue, and how big of an issue was it?
It's funny to call it an identity management issue, but I didn't actually realize I had an identity management issue at first because, like I said, I was really so focused on building the applications. It was when I got into ServiceNow and when I talked to those providers that I said, man, this is so much simpler than it used to be, and for good reason. So that was the first time when I actually realized that I've already made a mistake. I didn't know what I didn't know, and it turned out that it's a big issue. And, my story is kind of an interesting one in that, I was a little bit far down a path of doing some custom applications, building an identity and access management system as part of that. I kind of thought I needed to continue down that road. And that turned out to be a colossal mistake. As it turned out, it took a long time, as Ted talked about, and it was really never right. And so we built it, and it was complicated, and it didn't work very well. And I had to go back in and basically have Okta for those applications as well. So I did a complete about-face, but I wasted a good bit of time and a fair amount of money, not realizing that this is really not just good for integrating with ServiceNow, which is what I had originally thought, but it is very quick and very simple to integrate with custom-built applications. And that was something that, so identity management, it sort of creeped up on me. I still didn't realize what a big problem it was. I spent a lot of time and effort, and then it sort of whacked me in the head again. And then now I'm happy to say that I'm beyond that, and we have Okta for both our ServiceNow applications as well as our custom-built applications.
Okay, yeah, it sounds like there were unnecessary layers of complexity by doing it yourself there.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Now, once you came to that realization that you didn't need to bill it yourself, what sort of tools did you consider as you were looking around for a solution for your identity management needs?
Well, I actually, I was introduced to Okta early on with the FCC example of where that was done so successfully. And I really felt, had spent a lot of time talking to ServiceNow and the other providers, and really felt like Okta was absolutely perfect for the external-facing applications that we were doing with ServiceNow. And then, of course, after using Okta, that's when I said, this is going to be faster and easier than the work that I've been doing on these custom applications. And so, the key thing for me, frankly, was that it was easy to procure and it was FedRAMP certified, because if it didn't have the FedRAMP certification, it would have been really difficult for me to get an authorization to operate. And I didn't want to spend my time doing that when there were so many things that we needed to do to modernize and get off of our legacy systems. We needed to both modernize our business process, but also really get off of some very old infrastructure.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Now,
Leif, I want to add to that FedRAMP piece.
Yeah.
I didn't realize how important the FedRAMP authorization component was, and it was. I think the federal government's been conditioned to not talk to folks until they actually have it. I think the early adopters of other vendors, they got the, hey, we're going to have FedRAMP in a month, and they would buy it, and then the FedRAMP process doesn't take a month. The FedRAMP process is pretty laborious process.
Yeah.
And, customers would end up buying a service that they couldn't use for 6, 8, 10 months, because they didn't have the FedRAMP authorization. So, Karen, I know you were one of those. You're like, I'm not talking to you until you have FedRAMP.
Right, and part of that, Ted, you're right. I mean, I got burned by that. I didn't realize what a lengthy process it was, and I have made that mistake too of purchasing something, hoping that it's going to be FedRAMP authorized and going to get through my ATO relatively simply, and it hasn't worked out that way. And so, I can vouch for the fact that even with Tableau, I mean, I was until you have your FedRAMP, come talk to me then. Because I want to make sure that what we have is, especially when you have all these different platforms, and you have to, each one takes a lot of time through the assurance process to get authorized, and so if you've got all these different components, if you have a couple of things that aren't FedRAMP, it really, really delays it from the authorization to operate perspective. So that was a big deal for me.
It's a big deal for everyone.
Yeah. Sounds like it. Yeah. It sounds like it's definitely better to wait until the solutions have FedRAMP certification before charging ahead.
Yeah, back in the day, you could be in process for NIAP and customers would talk to you and buy your stuff. That's not the case. If you're in process on the FedRAMP website, they'll say, "Come see me when it says authorized."
Yep. All right. Now, Karen, it sounds like your first. Can you talk a little bit more about how you first approached this process? It sounded like you started off building your own solution. Can you tell me a little bit more about that experience?
Yeah, well, we were pretty far down the road before I had even talked to ServiceNow about doing case management to do some of our more sensitive applications on Microsoft Azure, a cloud provider, but actually, building our own custom applications. And so that seemed like a good idea at the time. And, some of those applications, and part of this is this concern. We have very sensitive data in this thing. And so, the question was, where's the security going to be? Where's the security going to be most solid? And how am I going to get through this authorization to operate process? And so we did the custom application, started down the identity and access management as I noted before, and actually once we had deployed or once we had implemented and started testing Okta with ServiceNow, I said, geez, this is so clean, this is so user friendly, this is so easy, and the stuff that we've built custom is complicated and difficult and just is going to be too much of a different experience for the same users that I basically had to make the choice at that point to move over and use Okta. And it was not a difficult choice. It was just difficult to have come so far with the custom application and have to sort of regroup and do Okta on the. But I'm happy to say that this was a recommendation by Okta at the very beginning. That I didn't take, and I should have, as it turns out. But I just was not convinced that they were going to be able to be as integrated as quickly and easily as they said they could do. I said, yeah, right, okay, and it turned out that they could, and that I should have taken their recommendation. But I did. To my credit, I learned quickly and, got off the path and started again. So, and that's been sort of the way my career has gone with all of these emerging technologies is, try something, and if it doesn't work, regroup and make a different decision and move on. So. Yep.
Learn from your experiences. That's a good way to go, for sure. Well, you mentioned also you have some very sensitive information that you're dealing with there, so I can imagine security was certainly top of mind
Yeah, I mean, our licensing, the identity, the access management and identity that we've been using in our legacy systems have been digital certifications, and this was another big issue that I was, Okta has worked really closely with us and with other federal agencies that have the same use cases to allow us to use anything that's in the Federated Bridge. It can be used as the identity, because what we want to make sure of is that that we know exactly who is submitting these applications for licenses.
Yep.
And so, there's a whole set of digital certifications that are just plug and play with the Okta identity solution that would have been even more complicated to try to custom build. So that was a huge factor in me moving over to Okta, was their ability, once they showed me that, yeah, we can do this, we can take any of these digital certs and, we can incorporate that use case into our platform. Then I was completely converted, and that's when I, made the change to use Okta for everything.
Yeah. All right, yeah, you alluded to this a bit, but what really steered you to take the approach that you did? What were some of the factors that contributed?
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, I mean, it was security, it was and security in a number of different fronts. It was making sure that we had the right identities and we knew who we were dealing with in terms of who was asking for these licenses and who we were, providing adjudicated licenses to. It was also the ease of being able to incorporate this technology into our applications, and I guess the ability to get it authorized to operate since it was FedRAMP certified, and those were, I think, the main reasons. And I have to say that it's just a really easy experience for the customers, and sometimes these things can be more convoluted and can be less streamlined. But I think because Okta is only doing this is what they're thinking about, and they're doing a better job than just a typical development team that is more focused, frankly, on the mission, which they should be. But identity can create so many help desk tickets and so many problems, and in terms of permissions and all of those sorts of things that it's really nice to have a company that is focused solely on that particular part of these applications.
Yep. I mean, certainly as critical as it is to ensure solid identity and access management, you also want to make it relatively easy for the people to use so they don't, ignore it or try to work around it, anything like that.
Leif, that is like the number one thing. It's we call it taking friction from the user. Typically, when you add security, you put that burden on the user. Our goal is to add security while lessening the burden on the user.
Yep. That's a valuable philosophy for sure. All right. Now, throughout this process, Karen, did you encounter any cultural barriers, and if so, how did you kind of work around those?
Well, I mean, I think initially when I went to our the assessors for the authorization to operate, there was initially, and this was a few years ago, there was reluctance about even using the cloud for any of this.
Yeah.
So it wasn't in particular about Okta, although they were certainly a part of it. But any of these platforms were not the way that we do business. It was, and this was when I first started. It was, what, the cloud? What are you doing? Why are you talking about that?
Yeah.
And then what happened? And I've been here for 4.5 years. So what happened is that people started thinking about it, and so very, very slowly at first, people were more interested in using the cloud and understanding the benefits of some of these platforms, to the point now where, fast forward 4 years, we have enterprise licenses with ServiceNow and Okta. So we've come a long way, it seems like a short period of time for government, but it was a number of years. So being the early adopter on this, it wasn't that popular, and people were wondering what I was doing, and I think we're a little bit nervous about what I was doing initially, and so I'm feeling really much more comfortable in my job and my role now that everybody's sort of very enthusiastic about these kinds of platforms and using them all over the Department of State.
Yep.
I'd like to add on to that, Leif. So I mentioned it's my 3-year anniversary today in the public sector, and the discussions I'm having today with the federal government versus the ones I had 3 years ago are diametrically opposed. And the folks that literally our first year we had 2 customers. It was the Department of Justice and FCC. Mm-hmm. And Department of Justice had a complete burning platform problem where it was like Karen's a case management system where they were putting all federal case files into Box and ServiceNow, and they couldn't figure out a way to authenticate users into that, incredibly sensitive data. And mm-hmm. It turns out we were probably the only company that could do it, so they had to do it. FCC, they had a very bold strategy. They were doing everything cloud. So mm-hmm. They've got 2, and then Karen comes on board. It was not a popular thing to do. It was, people thought they were crazy. Like, what are you doing? This is nuts. You can't go cloud. It's not secure. It has been proven. And in the federal government, no one likes to be the first one in the pond.
Yep.
But we've built our business off those successes. And the conversations I'm having now, it's government is adopting cloud in a really rapid fashion. And I would say one of the fastest transformations I've seen in my history in government. They've gone from being allergic to cloud to, we have to do this. And so, I'm seeing that across my peer groups: ServiceNow, Box, Salesforce, Workday. They're all having meaningful conversations and transforming the government, and that makes what Karen did scary when she did it. It was bold that she did it, but she's not the only one in the pond now.
But it's certainly a positive experience. It sounds like.
Yeah. Well, we had to make sure that was the case.
Yeah. Now, I'd add just a quick question that occurred to me, and I'd ask both of you. Do you think this increased adoption of the cloud and newer technologies is more driven by federal mandates or they're realizing these success stories, realizing that it actually does work?
I think it's a combination of both.
A little both, yeah.
Yeah. It's definitely the mandates. Are pushing it. Instead of saying, hey, you should think about doing cloud, it's like, hey, you're going to do cloud.
You have to do it.
Yeah, you have to do it. Yeah. That has your first question was about culture, right? The culture is definitely shifting at very high levels of government. Yep. It hasn't made it all the way down into the mid-range yet. It's also people that want to do things the way they've always done them. But that pressure is causing change. Having positive experiences also helps that, right? So it's like when Karen can call the FCC and they're like, dude, this is awesome, that makes it a lot easier for Karen to begin to trust us and to try it, and any other group that wants to go down the journey.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Now, Karen, as you work through this process, were there any sort of risks or other factors you experienced that might have added some complexity as you work through implementing identity management there?
Well, I think that probably the piece that I mentioned earlier with the digital certifications as our means of authenticating was something that initially it was not part of the Okta solution, and it was sort of midstream that it was added. So that was a factor for us, for sure, because we were not going to we needed to have that level, and there's a lot of agencies I think that need that, and so it was great that we were very aligned with Okta in terms of it was something that we're getting there, and it's going to be sooner rather than later. It's our top priority, and it really was, because it happened fairly quickly in the Okta life cycle, at least from my perspective. So that was something that I thought was a showstopper for me, and I think that was in retrospect, that was why I thought I had to do it myself, and why we went down that road to begin with. And so that was a complex piece of this. And I think that there were other, there were concerns. I mean, I noticed that there was a question from our listeners about whether Okta is FedRAMP low, medium, or high. We're a medium system. Okay. And Ted can probably talk about, whether there's any plans on the high front. But our data is categorized as moderate, and so that was an important piece of this for us. I mean, that was the beginning of when I started talking to Okta, was being FedRAMP moderate, because I wasn't interested in going down the road that Ted described before, where it might take 6 months, it might take a year to get the FedRAMP certification.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, I was literally just typing an answer to the question, so I'll just answer it now. So we are moderate. We have an IL2 accreditation from DoD, which is from DISA. We've done an assessment for IL4 equivalency pushed by U.S. Navy. Okay. We've completed that audit. We'll have the findings, I think, in March when we echo back to Navy. So we expect IL4 equivalency. We've committed to going FedRAMP high. That's funded. We're not in process on the FedRAMP website yet, but we should see that soon. Again, Karen, that's another 12 months, right, to get through that process.
Yep.
But we've committed to going.
Yeah, that's great. All right. Well, Karen, you've certainly been at it for a while there. What sort of metrics or results are you seeing from the process?
Well, I mean, I think that the ease of actually implementing this solution went from, it took us 9-10 months to build this on our own, as complicated as it was, with all these digital certifications and all of these different applications and pulling together all of the permissions and access management and all the rest of it. It took us, I don't know, 2 months to replicate that using Okta. So that's a huge, I mean, that's just, I can't even imagine that. I never would have thought it, but it was very quick, and they were very supportive. In terms of the difference in the metrics associated with our process for getting a user onboarded, the external user onboarded, we have a very, very manual process for that involves faxing and involves people taking pieces of paper and moving them among their, between their colleagues, and all sorts of insane stuff in our legacy process for onboarding a user from an entity. And when I talk about that, it's like the main user. So we have this concept of a super user, and they've got to get a letter from their empowered official, and they've got to do all of this crazy stuff. And so it would likely take an industry participant to get a super user account. If they were really motivated, it would probably take for us to set it up and do the whole thing 3 or 4 days, if we were really motivated. And for some people, if they didn't have it quite right or whatever, it might take longer than a week. And what we've been able to do is take all of our legacy users, migrate all that data, and literally a super user account is already created. There's an email that goes out, and all the person has to do is log in and put their two-factor authentication, and they're done. It's all of, I don't know how long it takes, 30 seconds, 45. So we're talking days to seconds.
Yep.
So and that's the most impactful metric I can think of that
right.
Really kind of brings it home how simple this process is. And for someone new, it's going to be just as simple, because we're modifying our business process, of course, as part of this modernization. So somebody registers, they identify who the super user is, they give us their email in that filing, and automatically, boom, Okta sends them a notice and says, you're the super user. Come on in and get your cell phone ready because you're going to do the two-factor authentication. 30 seconds later, they've got an account.
Yeah. Removing some of the friction, as Ted was saying earlier. Absolutely. All right. Now, this here's something you probably both want to chime in on. Well, what sort of advice would you have for an agency that wants to get started in deploying an identity management solution? What sort of first steps should they take?
Karen, can I start on that one?
Please.
All right. So users have been conditioned that identity and access management is like a really difficult, long-term, complex problem to solve, and that's not the case with modern identity services. So we can start very quickly, very small, a lot of times free to get started. So it would be my suggestion would be, hey, you're not entering into this multi-month kind of endeavor where you're allocating teams of people to support this thing to see if it works. It can be done. We've done proof of concepts in days and a week kind of a thing. So it's easy to get started. It's simple. Setting up an org. Our company likes to say we're a commoditized service. We're not customized for anything. We don't like the stuff that Karen uses is the same thing that DOJ uses, the same thing that Navy uses. The only difference is certain configurations that are unique to each environment. So it's really rapid to get started, and it can be a very, very low cost to do it.
Okay.
I would say just go.
Yeah, just start.
Just start. It's just finding the time to start's the tough part.
Yeah.
A lot of things on people's plates.
Absolutely. Karen, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? Or?
No, I think that's a great way of approaching it.
Okay.
It would have been. It's interesting because even if you're worried about if you're worried about configuring Okta with something that you're building that's not an off-the-shelf thing, I just would really encourage you to take seriously the notion that this is a solution for that as well. Don't make the mistake that I made thinking that it's only for the ServiceNows or the Salesforce or any of those things.
Yep. All right. Now, Karen, you also mentioned you're dealing a lot with internal and external users. What are some of the primary considerations or things you have to keep in mind between the differences of how you manage those users?
Well, so as Ted was saying, I mean, these are two different products within the platform, and the use cases are quite different from our perspective at State Department. Mm-hmm. We want one identity across state. There was a question actually on the board about whether the entire Department of State is using Okta at an enterprise level, and we are using it. Our plan is to use it at the enterprise level for cloud services. So that would be anything where a state employee is wanting to go on Office 365 to do email, so they're off-site. All of that would be through Okta. And then, of course, all the external users will eventually be going through Okta to get to the services that we provide.
Okay.
So I think, I'm not the expert by any means on all the good work that my colleagues are doing in the main State Department IT shop with all the internal users. But I do know, just from my own perspective, that I have internal users. They are small in number. And look, the important thing for the users is not that different from the external users. They need to be able to get to the right data at the right time from any device,
right,
to the extent that they can go from any device. Now, depending on the level of security around the data, they may not be able to do it from any device. But But that's really what we looked at from the department-wide vantage point, is that we wanted to provide employees with easy access to the data they need at any time from anywhere. And that was sort of our tenet. That was our marching orders, is go find that and make sure that it's secure. But make it easy on the users to do their jobs and get to the data they need to do these mission-critical activities.
Yep.
Leif, and the one thing I would add to that is the thing that's unique to the federal government is with HSPD 509. HSPD 12. PIV and CAT cards are everywhere, and that's unique to the internal user. So, from an Okta perspective, when we deal with workforce or workforce identity, we have to integrate with PIV and CAT cards. We have to take those certs and be able to integrate with that. On the external side, you typically don't issue a PIV or CAT card to an external user, but you want to have as close to that same level of security and trust. So, for example, with the Navy, with their external portal, it's something called My Navy Portal. All sailors, family members, beneficiaries need to have access to the benefits. And in the past, it was you had to go on base with a CAT card to get that, and that wasn't a user experience that was beneficial to the service member of the Navy. So Okta can deliver really secure external multi-factor type capabilities to external users while simultaneously on the inside accept the most secure factor, which is a PIV and CAT card that has the cert on it. So what Karen says, the use cases are totally different. You need a platform that can be able to work both.
That can handle both, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. Now, before we move into the audience Q&A, do you have any final thoughts, any final bits of advice for agencies that are interested in increasing their identity management posture?
Ted, do you have anything?
Well, it'd be really self-serving.
Covered a lot of stuff here.
Yeah, I mean, my only advice and my only recommendation would be agencies are modernizing. Yep. They need to consider modernizing their identity infrastructure as well. They're going to come to that conclusion at some point.
Got to be part of it.
Yeah, it's going to be part of it. When you're modernizing, think about modernizing identity and access management, because that's an important component of your effort, and you'll figure it out sooner or later.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's actually really great, because it's the sooner rather than the later, right? Because it's like anything else. You want to bake in your security, you want to bake in your identity management and access controls, and so I think that's great advice, Ted, because that's the piece that didn't work out exactly the way I, in retrospect, would have hoped. So,
well, I think you've taught some people. The Office of Comptroller Currency just released a 5-year contract to modernize 8 major mission systems for OCC.
Oh, wow.
First task order, it was won by Unisys. First task order was to do identity. Uh-huh. They're going to do identity before they start the first 8 mission systems, which is
all right. Good level of priority there for sure.
Well, that's right from our playbook anyway.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, and it makes sense though, because the idea.
I think they'll be well served. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, it does. It makes sense, but it's often overlooked. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for those valuable insights, Karen and Ted. That's some great stuff we've covered here. Now we've got time to move into a few questions from our live audience. And before we do that, just want to quickly remind everyone that you can download a copy of the presentations you just saw. Just look for the Resource Center below the question field. All right. To start off, we've got one question here. It's probably suited for you, Ted. Now, is the AWS Identity and Access Management and Okta, are those the same product?
They're not the same product. So Okta, from day one, we've been hosted in Amazon. Our founders, looked at all different cloud platforms. They chose Amazon, and I think that was a really good decision. Amazon has their own product. We partner very closely with Amazon, being that we're hosted in Amazon. We're part of the Amazon Partner Network, and we're part of their it's with AWS to ATO platform. So we're close partners with them, but completely different products.
Gotcha. All right. Here's a question probably more suited for Karen. Karen, in your experience, how is the process of setting up standardized roles and permissions?
Well, yeah, that's such a great question. It's very, very easy to do in Okta, but as you probably know, it's not easy to get everybody agreeing on what the standardized roles and permissions are. So
right.
I think we spend 90% of our time, or maybe even more, working with stakeholders and making sure that the office directors and the division chiefs were comfortable with what data other organizations could see, edit, insert, whatever. So those permissions, took a lot of coordination among all the different divisions, offices, and that was really the heavy lift. Actually, implementing it in Okta was a very short order, very simple. But again,
right.
it was a big deal because we were really changing fundamentally the transparency of the data, because we were all in silos before in our legacy system. So no one had access to other offices' data, and that was one of the things that was one of the major tenets of the IT modernization was to increase transparency across the enterprise data.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, how much was there much customization involved in implementing your identity management solutions?
I hope not.
No.
Better not have.
Ted, you alluded to the fact that you don't do much customization, so I would.
No, it didn't even come up. I mean, there wasn't anything where they had to put us back in our place and tell us not to, because it just worked. So we didn't. There was nothing special. As I mentioned before, we did have all these digital certs that we wanted to have incorporated, and that was all incorporated in the platform. So that was work that Okta did, and then we just were able to use it out of the box.
Perfect. Nope, that's definitely how you want it to go. Probably have time for one more quick question here. How was the process of integrating Okta with your existing tools and systems?
Yeah, like I said, it was surprisingly very easy to implement with our, and we weren't implementing it with our legacy systems that were old and ancient. I mean, we were implementing it with modern systems that we were building. So, and it was very straightforward, and the documentation was really good, and we were able to pick it up without a lot of issues. There were a couple of questions that we asked Okta directly, but that support was there, and we were able to do it very quickly.
Sounds good. Sounds like a good, straightforward process.
Yeah, I would add to that one of the other than the platform, the two key things that Okta focused very heavily on, one was being able to connect to our customers' identity stores in a really seamless, delightful fashion, better than the vendors that they have. That was one mission. The other one was to create a network of applications. We call it the Okta Integration Network. We've got over 6,000 applications that are pre-integrated for our users, and there's more being added every single day. We've got this whole network effect going on. We want to take our customers out of the integration business. That's the time-consuming piece of identity management, where you go, okay, well, I need to now talk to this, and a team has to come in and create that integration. Okta's done those for you. On the legacy stuff, like Karen talks about, those are a little more difficult. There's partnerships that we have that help us connect to those, but for any modern type stuff, that work should be done.
Sounds good. We're removing more friction, as you said earlier. All right. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. I would like to give a huge thanks to Karen Reggie and Ted Gerard for a very informative session. Covered some great stuff here. And I'd also like to thank Okta for sponsoring this webcast. I want to remind those of you in the audience that, again, within the next day or two, we'll email you a link to an archived version of this session so you can review it again or pass it along to share with a colleague. Thank you very much for attending today, and this concludes today's webcast.